At the beginning of the 20th century, the United States was transforming faster than ever before. Steel mills, railroads, and giant corporations were creating unprecedented wealth, while millions of children were entering classrooms that looked remarkably different from those of previous generations. Behind these parallel transformations stood some of the most influential industrialists in American history, including Andrew Carnegie. For more than a century, a persistent claim has circulated that Carnegie made a hidden agreement with American schools to reshape education according to the needs of industry. The story appears in books, documentaries, speeches, and online debates. But what actually happened? Was there a formal agreement, a coordinated reform movement, or a much more complex relationship between philanthropy, industrialization, and public education? This documentary separates documented history from enduring myth while exploring how one of America's richest men helped influence the future of education. 1. America before Carnegie's educational influence. Why literacy alone was no longer enough for an industrial nation. By the middle of the 19th century, the United States was still, in many ways, a nation of farms, small workshops, and scattered towns. For generations, basic literacy had been considered sufficient for most citizens. Reading, writing, and arithmetic allowed people to manage farms, conduct local business, read newspapers, and participate in civic life. The educational needs of an agricultural society were relatively modest because most occupations were learned within families or through apprenticeships rather than formal schooling. The Industrial Revolution fundamentally changed those expectations. Steam engines, mechanized factories, expanding railroads, and mass production created occupations that required workers to follow standardized procedures, understand written instructions, and operate increasingly sophisticated machinery. Employers were no longer looking only for individuals who could read a Bible or keep simple accounts. They needed a workforce capable of functioning within large, coordinated industrial systems. At the same time, American cities were growing at an extraordinary pace. Millions of immigrants arrived from Europe seeking opportunity, bringing with them different languages, customs, and educational backgrounds. Urban schools suddenly faced the challenge of educating children from dozens of cultures while preparing them to participate in a rapidly changing economy. Education became not only a means of teaching knowledge, but also a tool for social integration. Factories introduced an entirely different rhythm of life than farms had known. Agricultural work followed the seasons and the weather, often allowing considerable flexibility within the family. Industrial production, however, depended on fixed schedules, synchronized labor, punctuality, and cooperation among hundreds or even thousands of employees. Many educators and political leaders believed schools should help children develop habits that matched this new economic reality. The railroad network further accelerated these changes. As tracks connected distant regions into a single national market, businesses required employees who could communicate using standardized measurements, consistent bookkeeping practices, and common procedures. A more uniform educational system gradually became attractive because it reduced regional differences and helped prepare workers for an increasingly interconnected economy. Technological innovation also transformed the nature of work itself. New machinery required operators who could quickly learn updated methods, interpret technical manuals, and adapt to changing production techniques. While many jobs still demanded physical strength, employers increasingly valued workers who could absorb new information efficiently. The ability to learn continuously became more valuable than simply possessing basic literacy. These economic changes coincided with a broader political movement advocating expanded public education. Reformers such as Horace Mann had already argued that universal schooling could strengthen democracy by producing informed citizens capable of participating responsibly in public life. Industrialization reinforced these arguments, adding an economic dimension. Schools were increasingly seen as investments in the nation's future prosperity, rather than merely charitable institutions. Business leaders, however, did not all share identical motivations. Some believed education should cultivate independent thinkers capable of innovation and civic leadership. Others emphasized practical skills, discipline, and reliability, qualities they considered essential for modern industry. These competing visions often overlapped, creating educational reforms shaped by both democratic ideals and economic demands, rather than by a single unified agenda. Importantly, these transformations began before Andrew Carnegie emerged as one of America's leading philanthropists. The movement toward broader public education, compulsory attendance laws, teacher training, and standardized curricula reflected decades of social, political, and economic evolution. Carnegie would later become an influential participant in this landscape, but he entered a system that was already undergoing profound structural change. Understanding this historical context is essential because it challenges the idea that American education was reshaped by one individual or one hidden agreement. By the time Carnegie began investing heavily in educational institutions, the United States had already concluded that an industrial nation required far more than citizens who could simply read and write. It needed engineers, teachers, managers, technicians, scientists, administrators, and informed voters capable of navigating a society growing more complex with every passing decade. 2. Andrew Carnegie's philosophy: wealth, responsibility, and social reform. Why Carnegie preferred funding institutions instead of direct charity. Andrew Carnegie's views on philanthropy were shaped long before he became one of the wealthiest men in the world. Born into a modest family in Scotland, he experienced economic hardship before emigrating to the United States as a child. His rise from factory worker to steel magnate convinced him that opportunity, education, and self-improvement had played decisive roles in his own success. By the time he retired from business, he had begun asking a question few industrialists had considered so seriously: what should become of immense private fortunes after they had been accumulated? His answer appeared most clearly in his 1889 essay, The Gospel of Wealth, where Carnegie argued that the wealthy had a moral responsibility to return their fortunes to society. Yet he rejected the idea that this should happen through indiscriminate gifts of money to individuals. In his view, simply distributing wealth could provide temporary relief from poverty, but it rarely addressed the conditions that prevented people from improving their own lives. He believed philanthropy should create opportunities rather than dependence. Carnegie frequently argued that the greatest form of charity was to provide people with the tools to help themselves. A public library, for example, could educate generations of readers long after its construction. A university could train scientists, engineers, teachers, and physicians for decades. A research institution could produce discoveries benefiting millions. These investments, he believed, multiplied their impact over time in ways that direct financial assistance could not. This philosophy reflected broader intellectual currents of the late 19th century. Many reformers believed lasting social progress came through education, scientific knowledge, and institutional development, rather than through temporary relief programs. Carnegie embraced these ideas enthusiastically, seeing schools, libraries, museums, and universities as engines capable of expanding human potential across entire communities. His commitment to libraries became the most visible expression of this philosophy. Carnegie financed the construction of more than 2,500 libraries around the world, but he rarely paid for their long-term operation. Communities receiving a library were expected to provide the land, maintain the building, and fund its daily activities. Carnegie believed local investment ensured that people valued the institution and accepted responsibility for its future. The same principle guided his support for higher education. Rather than awarding large numbers of scholarships directly to individual students, Carnegie often preferred strengthening universities themselves. Better facilities, improved teaching standards, research funding, and professional organizations, he believed, would benefit countless students over successive generations instead of helping only a limited number of recipients. This institutional approach also reflected Carnegie's confidence in organized systems. Having built one of the largest industrial enterprises of his era, he understood how durable organizations could produce results that individuals acting alone could not. Just as corporations coordinated labor and capital to manufacture steel on an unprecedented scale, he believed educational institutions could systematically expand knowledge and opportunity across society. Historians continue to debate Carnegie's philosophy. Admirers argue that his investments created lasting public benefits that still serve millions today, while critics note the tension between enormous private fortunes and the influence wealthy donors could exercise over public priorities. Rather than viewing Carnegie solely as either a generous benefactor or a powerful industrialist protecting his legacy, many scholars see him as both, an individual whose philanthropy reflected sincere convictions, while also shaping institutions according to his own vision of social progress. Understanding why Carnegie preferred funding institutions instead of direct charity helps explain his lasting influence on American education. His goal was not simply to relieve immediate hardship, but to build organizations that would continue producing knowledge, opportunity, and social mobility long after his lifetime. Whether one views that strategy as visionary, paternalistic, or a combination of both, it became one of the defining models of modern philanthropy and continues to influence charitable foundations around the world today. 3. Did a secret agreement really exist? Which historical documents actually exist, and which do not? The claim that Andrew Carnegie entered into a secret agreement with the American education system has circulated for decades. It appears in documentaries, books, lectures, and countless online discussions, often presented as the hidden explanation for why modern schools supposedly prioritize obedience over independent thinking. The story is compelling because it offers a single, powerful narrative connecting industrial wealth, education, and social change. Yet when historians begin looking for documentary evidence, the picture becomes far more complicated. One of the first questions any historical investigation asks is simple: where is the original document? If a formal nationwide agreement had been signed between Carnegie and American schools, historians would expect to find contracts, official correspondence, government records, meeting minutes, legislative acts, or institutional archives describing such an arrangement. Despite extensive research into Carnegie's personal papers, philanthropic foundations, and government archives, no authenticated document establishing a secret nationwide educational agreement has ever been discovered. This absence is particularly significant because Carnegie's life was exceptionally well documented. He wrote thousands of letters, published essays, delivered speeches, maintained detailed business records, and established philanthropic organizations whose archives remain available to researchers. His foundations carefully recorded grants, financial decisions, trustee meetings, and educational initiatives. These materials provide an unusually complete picture of his public activities, making the absence of any formal, secret agreement difficult to ignore. What historians do find instead are extensive records documenting Carnegie's legitimate philanthropic work. There are official incorporation papers for the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching, financial records showing donations to colleges and universities, correspondence concerning library construction, reports on teacher pensions, and publications discussing educational reform. These documents demonstrate enormous influence over educational institutions, but they do not describe a hidden pact controlling the nation's schools. Some proponents of the agreement theory point instead to broader networks of wealthy industrialists and philanthropists who supported educational reform during the Progressive Era. This part of the historical record is well documented. Carnegie, John D., Rockefeller, educational reformers, university presidents, state governments, and private foundations often shared an interest in expanding professional education, improving administrative standards, and modernizing public institutions. Collaboration certainly existed, but collaboration is not the same as a secret coordinated agreement. The confusion often arises because influence can appear similar to control. Carnegie's financial resources allowed him to shape important institutions by funding libraries, universities, research organizations, and educational foundations. Those investments affected higher education for generations, encouraging professional standards, teacher development, and institutional reform. However, influencing public policy through philanthropy differs fundamentally from secretly directing an entire national education system through undisclosed agreements. Historians also distinguish carefully between documented facts and retrospective interpretation. It is entirely reasonable to debate whether industrial leaders preferred educational systems that produced disciplined, skilled workers suited to a modern economy. Contemporary speeches, business publications, and educational reports often discussed these objectives openly. But recognizing shared economic interests does not establish the existence of a hidden contract unless documentary evidence demonstrates one. Another reason the theory persists is that genuine historical documents are sometimes quoted without their original context. Passages from Carnegie's writings, educational commission reports, or philanthropic correspondence can appear striking when isolated, encouraging readers to infer intentions that extend beyond what the documents actually state. Professional historians therefore emphasize reading entire collections, comparing multiple sources, and distinguishing personal opinion, institutional recommendation, and official government policy. This illustrates one of the central principles of historical research. Absence of evidence is not always evidence of absence, but extraordinary claims require correspondingly strong evidence. A nationwide secret agreement involving one of America's most famous industrialists, thousands of schools, and multiple levels of government would almost certainly have generated a substantial documentary trail. After more than a century of scholarship, no such authenticated record has emerged. The historical evidence therefore points toward a more nuanced conclusion. Andrew Carnegie unquestionably influenced American education through philanthropy, institutional funding, and public advocacy, all extensively documented in surviving archives. What historians have not found is credible evidence of a formal secret agreement directing the nation's schools behind closed doors. The real story is arguably more interesting than the myth. It reveals how wealth, philanthropy, democratic institutions, educational reform, and industrial transformation interacted in complex ways to reshape American education without requiring a single hidden contract to explain the outcome. 4. The Carnegie Foundations and the transformation of higher education. Why libraries became Carnegie's most visible educational legacy. When Andrew Carnegie retired from the steel industry at the beginning of the 20th century, he turned his attention almost entirely to philanthropy. Rather than distributing his fortune through scattered donations, he created permanent foundations designed to continue supporting education, science, and public institutions long after his death. These organizations became some of the most influential philanthropic institutions of their era, shaping higher education in ways that extended far beyond the buildings they financed. One of the most significant was the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching, established in 1905. Its original mission was to improve the quality of higher education by supporting university professors and encouraging professional standards. At a time when many colleges varied enormously in academic quality, the foundation helped stimulate conversations about accreditation, faculty qualifications, institutional governance, and educational excellence that would influence American universities for decades. The foundation's work reached beyond financial support. It sponsored research, collected educational data, and encouraged universities to adopt clearer academic standards. Over time, these efforts contributed to a more consistent understanding of what constituted a college degree, how institutions should be evaluated, and how professional education could be strengthened. Although many organizations participated in these reforms, Carnegie's foundation became one of the most recognizable voices in the movement. Carnegie also established the Carnegie Institution of Washington, dedicated to scientific research rather than classroom instruction. By funding laboratories, scholars, and long-term research projects, the institution reflected his belief that universities should not merely transmit existing knowledge, but actively expand it. Scientific discovery, in Carnegie's view, was one of the greatest investments a society could make in its future. Yet despite these influential contributions to higher education, Carnegie's name became associated above all with libraries. Between 1883 and 1929, more than 2,500 Carnegie libraries were built across the English-speaking world and beyond, including nearly 1,700 in the United States alone. No other philanthropic project connected his name so directly with everyday communities. The reason was both practical and philosophical. Carnegie regarded libraries as democratic institutions, unlike almost any other. A university served enrolled students, while a library welcomed virtually anyone willing to walk through its doors. A factory worker could study engineering after work. An immigrant could learn English. A child could discover literature. And an entrepreneur could educate himself without paying tuition. To Carnegie, libraries represented equal access to opportunity rather than equal distribution of wealth. Importantly, Carnegie rarely handed communities a completed institution with no obligations attached. Cities requesting a library generally had to provide suitable land, commit public funds for maintenance, and guarantee ongoing operation. This requirement reflected his conviction that philanthropy should encourage local responsibility instead of replacing it. Communities that invested their own resources were, he believed, more likely to preserve and value the institution for generations. The cultural impact of these libraries extended far beyond books. In many towns, the Carnegie Library became a civic landmark, a place where public lectures, educational programs, community meetings, and independent study all took place under one roof. For millions of Americans, particularly those living far from major universities, the local library became the most accessible gateway to higher learning and personal advancement. Historians often note that Carnegie's educational legacy was therefore both direct and indirect. His foundations influenced universities through research, professional standards, and institutional support, while his libraries reached ordinary citizens on an unprecedented scale. Together, these initiatives reflected a consistent philosophy. Durable institutions could generate opportunities for countless people over many decades, multiplying the impact of every philanthropic dollar invested. More than a century later, many Carnegie libraries remain in use, while the foundations he established continue to influence educational research and public policy. Their enduring presence illustrates why Carnegie's legacy cannot be reduced to a single theory about industrial influence or educational reform. His most visible contribution was not a hidden agreement or secret directive, but a vast network of public institutions built on the belief that access to knowledge could transform both individual lives and society itself. 5. Industry, schools, and the Progressive Era. Immigration, urbanization, and the expansion of compulsory schooling. By the late 19th century, the United States was experiencing one of the fastest periods of economic and demographic transformation in its history. factories multiplied, cities expanded, and railroads connected distant regions into a single national economy. At the same time, millions of immigrants arrived from Europe and other parts of the world, bringing different languages, customs, religions, and educational experiences. Together, these developments created pressures that neither local communities nor the existing school system had ever faced before. Between the 1880s and the outbreak of the First World War, immigration reached unprecedented levels. Families arrived from Italy, Poland, Russia, Austria, Hungary, the Balkans, and many other regions, settling primarily in rapidly growing industrial cities such as New York, Chicago, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, and Boston. In some neighborhoods, dozens of languages could be heard within just a few city blocks, creating extraordinary cultural diversity alongside significant social challenges. For many political leaders and education reformers, public schools became the primary institution capable of integrating these diverse populations into American civic life. Schools were expected not only to teach reading and mathematics, but also to introduce children to the English language, American history, constitutional principles, and shared civic traditions. Education increasingly became an instrument of nation-building as much as academic instruction. Urbanization intensified these demands. As factories attracted workers from both rural America and overseas, cities struggled with overcrowded housing, inadequate sanitation, child labor, and widespread poverty. Large numbers of children entered the workforce at very young ages, often spending long hours in textile mills, coal mines, steel plants, or family workshops instead of classrooms. Reformers argued that expanding education was essential if future generations were to escape this cycle. These concerns contributed to the gradual expansion of compulsory schooling laws across the United States. Although Massachusetts had introduced the first statewide compulsory attendance law in 1852, many other states strengthened or adopted similar legislation during the Progressive Era. By requiring children to attend school for a minimum number of years, governments sought to increase literacy, reduce child labor, and prepare citizens for participation in an increasingly industrial and democratic society. The Progressive Era also witnessed growing efforts to professionalize education itself. Teacher training institutions expanded, standardized textbooks became more common, and school administrators began introducing more systematic methods of organization. Reformers believed that larger urban school systems required consistent curricula, clearer administrative structures, and professionally trained educators capable of serving rapidly growing student populations. Industry influenced these reforms, though not always in the simplistic way later narratives sometimes suggest. Factory managers valued punctuality, reliability, cooperation, and basic technical competence because these qualities supported efficient production. Some educators borrowed organizational ideas from modern industry, believing schools could operate more effectively through standardized schedules, graded classrooms, and specialized administrative roles. Others, however, emphasized creativity, citizenship, and critical thinking, arguing that education should prepare individuals for democratic participation rather than merely employment. Immigration added another layer of complexity. Many immigrant parents viewed education as the clearest path toward economic mobility for their children, even when attendance meant sacrificing valuable household income. At the same time, some communities worried that schools encouraged cultural assimilation at the expense of traditional languages and customs. The classroom, therefore, became a meeting place where different visions of American identity were constantly negotiated. Philanthropic organizations, universities, local governments, religious institutions, labor advocates, and business leaders all participated in debates about educational reform during this period. Their goals frequently overlapped, but were rarely identical. Some focused on expanding opportunity, others on improving industrial productivity, others on strengthening democratic institutions, and still others on reducing social inequality. The resulting education system reflected the interaction of these competing priorities rather than the blueprint of any single individual or organization. Andrew Carnegie entered this evolving landscape as one influential philanthropist among many participants shaping educational development. His investments in libraries, universities, and educational foundations complemented reforms that were already underway, but they did not create the broader movement toward compulsory schooling or urban educational expansion. Those developments emerged from decades of demographic growth, industrialization, political reform, and public debate occurring across the nation. Looking back, the progressive era reveals that American education evolved in response to profound historical forces rather than a single coordinated plan. Immigration filled cities with new populations, industrialization transformed the nature of work, urbanization exposed social inequalities, and compulsory schooling became one of the nation's principal responses to these interconnected challenges. The schools that emerged were products of negotiation, compromise, and competing visions of America's future, a complexity that is often lost when history is reduced to a single explanation. 6. Why the Carnegie Agreement story refuses to disappear. What historians still debate about industrial philanthropy. More than a century after Andrew Carnegie began donating his fortune, the idea of a secret agreement between industrialists and American schools continues to attract attention. The persistence of the story is not simply the result of misinformation. It reflects a broader question that historians, economists, and political scientists still consider important today. How much influence should wealthy private individuals have over public institutions? While the evidence does not support the existence of a hidden national agreement, the debate over industrial philanthropy remains very much alive. One reason the story survives is that Carnegie's influence was undeniably real. His foundations helped finance universities, libraries, research institutions, and educational reforms on a remarkable scale. When a single individual possesses the resources to shape institutions serving millions of people, it is natural for later generations to ask how much influence accompanied that generosity. The historical debate therefore focuses less on secret contracts and more on the relationship between private wealth and public policy. Historians generally agree that industrial philanthropy transformed American education, but they differ in how they interpret its consequences. Some scholars argue that philanthropists like Carnegie accelerated educational progress by providing resources governments could not yet supply. Their investments expanded access to libraries, strengthened universities, encouraged research, and promoted professional standards that benefited society as a whole. Others offer a more critical interpretation. They acknowledge Carnegie's genuine commitment to education, while asking whether philanthropic foundations inevitably reflected the values and priorities of their founders. Even without formal political authority, wealthy donors could influence which institutions expanded, which research received funding, and which educational models gained national prominence. This influence was usually exercised openly rather than secretly, but its long-term effects remain an important subject of scholarly discussion. The progressive era itself encouraged this complexity. It was a period when government, universities, private foundations, businesses, and civic organizations increasingly worked together to address national problems. Educational reform rarely emerged from one institution acting alone. Instead, policies developed through cooperation, negotiation, disagreement, and compromise among many different actors. Understanding this broader context makes simplistic explanations far less convincing. Another reason the Carnegie Agreement narrative remains attractive is psychological. Complex historical developments often resist simple explanations. The modernization of American education involved industrialization, immigration, urban growth, compulsory schooling, political reform, changing labor markets, demographic shifts, and evolving educational theory. Such complexity can feel unsatisfying, leading some audiences to prefer a single dramatic story that appears to explain everything at once. The rise of the internet has further amplified this tendency. Historical quotations, archival photographs, and genuine Carnegie documents are frequently shared online without their original context. When authentic materials are combined with speculation or selective interpretation, they can create narratives that appear persuasive despite lacking documentary support. Historians therefore place great emphasis on examining complete archival records rather than isolated excerpts. Importantly, scholarly debate has never centered on whether Carnegie cared about education. The documentary record clearly demonstrates that he did. The real questions concern motivation, influence, and consequence. Was his philanthropy primarily an expression of civic responsibility? Did it also reinforce certain social and economic ideals? Can both interpretations be true simultaneously? Many historians argue that they can, recognizing that historical figures often acted from multiple motives rather than a single objective. This debate extends far beyond Carnegie himself. Similar questions are asked about other major philanthropists, from John D. Rockefeller in the early 20th century to large private foundations operating today. How should societies balance gratitude for private generosity with democratic accountability? At what point does philanthropy become influence? And when does influence become power? These questions remain relevant precisely because they have no universally accepted answer. Perhaps the greatest lesson historians draw from Carnegie's legacy is the importance of distinguishing documented evidence from historical interpretation. The archives clearly record his donations, speeches, foundations, correspondence, and educational initiatives. They do not reveal a hidden nationwide agreement directing American schools. At the same time, those same records invite legitimate discussion about how concentrated wealth can shape public institutions through voluntary philanthropy, rather than formal government authority. In the end, the enduring fascination with the so-called Carnegie Agreement says as much about the present as it does about the past. Modern societies continue to wrestle with the role of billionaires, private foundations, and corporate influence in education, science, and public life. Carnegie's story remains compelling, not because historians uncovered a secret contract, but because it raises enduring questions about who helps shape a nation's future, how that influence is exercised, and where the balance should lie between private initiative and democratic oversight. 7. Carnegie's real legacy in American education: the continuing debate over philanthropy and public policy. More than a century after Andrew Carnegie donated the vast majority of his fortune, his influence on American education remains unmistakable. Thousands of libraries, stronger universities, research institutions, and educational foundations stand as tangible reminders of his belief that knowledge could transform society. Yet perhaps his greatest legacy is not found in brick buildings or institutional names, but in the enduring conversation he helped ignite about the relationship between private wealth and the public good. Few historians dispute that Carnegie expanded educational opportunities for millions of people. His libraries opened their doors to factory workers, immigrants, children, and adults who otherwise had limited access to books or formal learning. His foundations encouraged higher academic standards, supported teachers, and promoted research that shaped universities throughout the 20th century. These achievements remain among the most significant philanthropic contributions in modern history. At the same time, Carnegie's example continues to provoke important questions. Should individuals with extraordinary wealth possess the ability to influence national priorities through charitable giving? Even when those intentions are generous, does philanthropy inevitably reflect the personal values of its donors? These questions have become increasingly relevant in every generation that has followed. Supporters of Carnegie's approach argue that private philanthropy can move faster than governments, experiment with innovative ideas, and invest in long-term projects that political institutions sometimes struggle to sustain. Many of America's leading universities, museums, hospitals, and research centers owe part of their development to private donations. From this perspective, philanthropy has often served as a catalyst for educational and scientific progress. Critics, however, emphasize that public institutions ultimately belong to society as a whole, not to their benefactors. They argue that decisions affecting education should be shaped through democratic processes rather than by the preferences of a small number of wealthy individuals, regardless of their intentions. This debate is not unique to Carnegie's era. It continues to influence discussions about education, healthcare, technology, and scientific research today. Modern philanthropists often face the same questions Carnegie encountered more than 100 years ago. When billionaires establish foundations, fund universities, finance scholarships, or support scientific research, society once again asks where generosity ends and influence begins. The names may have changed, but the underlying discussion remains remarkably familiar. What makes Carnegie's story particularly fascinating is that both admiration and criticism can coexist without contradiction. His libraries undeniably expanded access to knowledge. His educational foundations genuinely contributed to academic development. At the same time, his enormous influence reminds us that philanthropy is never entirely separate from questions of power, priorities, and public accountability. History rarely presents simple heroes or villains. It presents individuals whose actions produce lasting benefits alongside difficult ethical questions. The popular myth of a secret agreement between Carnegie and American schools may therefore reveal something deeper about how people interpret history. Complex institutional change often feels unsatisfying because it lacks a single dramatic cause. A hidden contract offers a simple explanation, while the documented historical record reveals something far more intricate. Decades of industrial growth, immigration, political reform, educational innovation, private philanthropy, and democratic debate unfolding simultaneously. In many ways, that more complicated story is also the more meaningful one. It reminds us that institutions rarely change because of one person alone. They evolve through countless decisions made by teachers, lawmakers, philanthropists, parents, scholars, business leaders, and ordinary citizens, responding to the challenges of their own time. Carnegie was undeniably one of the most influential participants in that process, but he was never its sole architect. Perhaps the most valuable lesson from Carnegie's legacy is methodological rather than ideological. Historical investigation requires us to distinguish carefully between evidence and speculation, between documented influence and unsupported claims. Asking difficult questions strengthens our understanding of the past, but meaningful conclusions must ultimately rest on verifiable sources rather than compelling narratives alone. The debate over philanthropy and public policy will almost certainly continue as long as private fortunes and public institutions exist side by side. Carnegie's life demonstrates both the extraordinary possibilities and the enduring tensions that accompany great wealth devoted to public purposes. His legacy is not a secret agreement hidden in forgotten archives, but an open historical conversation that continues to shape how societies think about education, opportunity, and civic responsibility. If you found this documentary insightful, consider subscribing to the channel and joining us for future investigations into the overlooked forces that have shaped our world. History is often far more complex and far more fascinating than the simplified stories we inherit. In our next documentary, we'll continue exploring the decisions, institutions, and individuals whose influence still echoes through the modern world. Until then, thank you for watching.